oh my God, I cannot breathe. Hello, you're free.
I believe that the tree of knowledge of good and evil is Iboga.
Shamanic practice is to actually go visit yourself at your own death.
Withdraw your permission. Tell it to get the hell out of here.
They use crushed seashells, coca leaves, and saliva.
Then I land back on Earth. Everybody thinks it's just been 3 years, but it's been maybe 3 lifetimes for me.
The Hunting for Healers podcast. I'm Frank Vogt. Every time a patient comes to my office, we begin the healing by laying our stories on the table, our stories about pain, the archetypes that we hold in our healing journey. So important. It's a way of storytelling. If you look at movies, film, this is so often how we heal, through the stories we hold. I use tarot cards as the methodology for that storytelling, for that healing. The patients see the cards and I facilitate a healing understanding. So I'm not reading the future. I'm not doing anything like that. I'm looking at the cards as a way to unblock and externalize the healing process. The tarot deck that I use is an old French deck called the Tarot de Marseille. It was restored by a filmmaker, Chilean filmmaker named Alejandro Jodorowsky. Jodorowsky is a powerful filmmaker. There's a great documentary called Jodorowsky's Dune. He tried one of the versions of the fiction story Dune, and he never got it off the ground, but it was so amazing, and he should have. We didn't have the karma for it. He also created a magical movie called The Holy Mountain, and if you've never seen it, it's wild, and you have to be ready for it, but it'll blow your mind. Anyway, he's also a tarologist in the sense that he uses tarot cards, he's written books on it, and he restored the Tarot de Marseille. So he's always inspired me. So I use these French cards, but the images on the cards are all from old France. They're white people with blonde hair, all of them. They don't look like my patients. And it's because identification is part of storytelling. I feel like my tarot deck is not very diverse. I have about 15 or 20 others, but yet I like to use this deck because I study the images, the gestures, and they're so important to really get intimate with one deck. So I thought, wouldn't it be great to have this same deck, but have people that look like my patients? And I came across it finally. And they were done by a man named King Khan, who's a musician from Canada, who's of Indian descent and lives in Berlin. He worked with an Irish artist who worked on Game of Thrones to create this deck. And it's fabulous. He uses Black artists, magicians, people that have inspired him in his creative journey. And he uses their imagery on the deck. And so I got a hold of him and I said, let me interview you for this podcast because I finally found my deck. And not only that, he's got a Native American deck as well that's still based on the Tarot de Marseille. So we'll get into that a bit. So King Khan, he studied with Jodorowsky. Jodorowsky actually guided him on this process of renewing the images. He thought it was a great idea. And King Khan himself is just a magical man. He's a very flamboyant, a very provocative performer. He combines all these different archetypes in his performance and different styles of music, from blues to rock to punk to reggae to R&B. I'm so lucky to have him on today to talk about his tarot deck, the Black Power Tarot deck it is called, perfectly named, and to talk about his time studying with Jodorowsky and the music and the art and how it has moved through him. I mean, we could have done 6 hours. So King Khan, let's begin it. Let's roll the tape. Oh, by the way, I would suggest for this podcast in specific that you also watch the YouTube version. If you want, download the podcast, that'd be great. But you can go to the YouTube link I will leave in the show notes, and you can watch it, and therefore you can see the cards and the imagery as we talk about it. That might be helpful. So, all right, let's get it going.
When I first started playing punk rock with the Spacious, our whole thing was about going crazy. I was exhibitionist, kind of getting naked, running around, it was like very punk. And one of my brothers, Berserker, we used to call him, Mohawk brother, he was 8 years older than me, and he was an iron worker. He used to work high up in the buildings, in New York City and stuff. And he, was a major, he loved psychedelics, as did I at that point. And so whenever we played shows, and I would feel free to push the envelope because I knew that I had my First Nations security brother, like no one would fuck with me because, we had these people with us. So in some ways, I feel like my freedom on stage, I owe a little bit to the Mohawks.
Wow, fantastic. And so I imagine for you the system of finding archetypes and blending it with your authenticity is something that means a lot.
Indeed, actually, I think I've always considered myself an outsider. My parents are both from North India, but I was born in Montreal, right, in Canada. And, I was on this little turtle-shaped island, which, that island 2,000 years ago, was inhabited by the Algonquin and the Mohawk. Yeah. And so I feel like in some way I've been really inspired by this whole decolonizing movement that's happening right now. Mm-hmm. And it kind of just occurred to me now that actually in some sense Black Power Tarot is a decolonization of the Tarot de Marseille. Wow. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's really fascinating, this whole trip about decolonization, because for my parents being from India, they had their own very kind of traumatic experiences with colonization. My father especially, when he was a child, it was during the partition time of India, where there was like Pakistan and India were like separating, and there was a lot of violence, and there was a lot of mobs of people killing people and attacking villages. And I remember my father told me a really harrowing story about him as a child, and all the women and children in his village had to hide in a wheat silo for like a week because there was this raving mob of people out to kill. I would think, anyways, it was really rough. And they had, in silence, they had to sit in this wheat silo. And, there's no bathroom in a wheat silo. So like, just imagine, how horrific that is. And so in that sense, I've had a very like fucked up relationship with my dad, even before I was born. He shot my mom down the stairs, when I was in her belly, so wow. In some sense, I was even kind of under attack before coming out of the world. But yeah, he was a violent, crazy person who should have been on medication, but instead, wound up in some really hairy situations. He got addicted to cocaine. He was shooting cocaine at one point. My mom found a burnt spoon in our basement and didn't know, what that was, So there was a lot of trauma as a child for me. And it also, it kind of creates this roller coaster of where, it's like when my dad wasn't around, we would be on cloud nine, playing, having the best time with, my brother and sister. We're all 1 year apart. But when then he would be there, or he's trying to teach us stuff, and it's like violent, and, and like there's beatings, and there's like, a lot of, it was terrifying. So, and I see, my struggles later on in my life, I'm bipolar, and I see a lot of, I know where that comes from. I know it came from this kind of a schizophrenia of like, being an abused kid, Yeah. So, and I started having children with my wife, quite early. I was 22, when my daughter Sabalu was born. And 2 years later, Bella was born, and part of my repairing myself was, in becoming a father myself and not repeating, the abuses that I was put through. But at the same time, when I say this, and this is all a part of this whole decolonizing conversation, is that I look at my father's, not just in a hateful way. I mean, there were moments, of course, that was there, but now I'm 44. And like, and I look at his path, and he went through some very heavy shit, and like they always say, the abuser becomes the abusee, or whatever, or however you phrase that. Sure. But I understand where that came from, and I understand why drug addiction was so easy for him to fall into. I mean, it was cocaine, for example, which is just like an ego trip. And so But I will give him one crazy, like compliment is that like no one expects a Indian university professor to fall into a drug hole of cocaine and shooting cocaine and hanging out with bikers who came out of jail in hotel rooms, and I think in a sense he found this new audience for his ego, and it was an audience that was dangerous, and I think that was a part of the thrill for him. And in the reverse way too, it's like they're like, why is this Indian university professor hanging out with us lowlife? So there was this thing going on, and I mean, I only kind of digested this later in my life though, because like when I was experiencing it, it was very heavy.
Wow, you impressed me so much listening to your music and getting into these tarot, because you've taken, much like the archetypes and people you've chosen for these cards, you've taken the pain of your life and real pain, and you've held it in a way that has been a benefit to others.
Thank you. I mean, that's a very nice compliment, and I think this whole idea of decolonization, that it shouldn't just be a buzzword that's like floating around everywhere, but or maybe it should be, but it should be on the minds of everyone.
Well, here's my story about the tarot. So I've been doing the tarot probably close to 15 years.
Cool.
And, in the beginning, I didn't know shit. I was just like, I read the cards, get a book and like read through the book.
Right.
And I'd say about 5 years ago, I got a hold of the Jodorowsky deck, the Marseille deck, the French deck that he was.
Right. Yeah.
And then his books,
The Way of Tarot.
Books. Yeah, the spiritual teacher, The Way of the Tarot. I'd known him a bit from the movie, The Holy Mountain. It took my tarot understanding to a whole level. But in my office,
yeah, me too.
I have people coming from all over the world, all different backgrounds, ethnicities, colors. And there's something that when I'm using this 1700s French impression images, all these white, blonde people all the time, sometimes I figure it would be interesting. I wonder if people would identify it better if they look different, but kept the same symbology, gestures, energy.
That's exactly what I did with the Black Power deck.
Yeah. So when I found them, I was so excited because lots of times I'll use the cards in a way, and I know Jodorowsky did a bit of this for like a constellation reading. So people can choose who the cards represent, and then based on the way we choreograph them on the table and how they move, it represents change and movement within their people's family grid or
that's really interesting that you say that, because so you get them to choose the cards and put them where they want.
Sometimes, often I'll do a reading, just like, they'll pick a number between 0 and 21 and I'll shuffle them and read out. But sometimes when we're doing specific constellation work, I want to see them choose the cards. They might not know unconsciously, but at least unconsciously they're choosing cards.
That's really interesting, because I years ago I started also doing my own version of the constellation with the tarot. But my thing was not that they would randomly choose the cards for each person in their life, and then put them where they belonged on the table. That was the way I approached it.
That's another way I've done it. I've done
that. But it's remarkable actually. I've had opportunities where I remember at a friend's wedding once I busted out the tarot late at night. Everyone was drinking, and I think it was like 6 brothers and sisters from the same family sit around, and we did it together, and it was incredible. Like especially, because there's so many people in the family. So it's like when I start talking about, the card and what it means, like, people are just like, oh my God, that's crazy. That's so precise, and I love that about tarot. The more I learn about it, I find it gets really more precise with the readings,
For me, it's a little bit like the American game of baseball, where in one at bat, I can hit a home run and everything feels great. The next at bat, I strike out and I feel like I don't know anything about anything.
That's the first time I heard tarot compared. I like curling.
Could write a book on that.
Sacred art of curling.
That's like that. I like that. So you are someone you've taken on many roles and many images. I listen to your music, and from even within a song, but certainly from song to song, I hear James Brown, then I hear Bob Dylan, then I hear Tina Turner does, like, you're going all over the place, but authentically, not just like on a weekend.
Thank you.
It's intentional. Obviously, I know almost all of the images used for the Black Power Tarot in terms of who they are, but I sat with each of them again to kind of like refresh myself. And wow, man, I mean, I guess similar to your story, a lot of these American Black pioneers in art and music and spirituality, but they suffered an immense amount. And there was an alchemical movement from the pain and the shit that they went through to the gold that they
Yes.
produce and gleam, even if it was just momentary.
I often compare that exact thing you're talking about with the process that coal is turned into a diamond. Coal is this, the blackest of elements that's like within all of us. And when you put this immense pressure on it, it becomes this irreplaceable diamond, And I feel like the all of the music and enlightenment that came out of Black music, that's what it was about. It was just like living in this immense pressure in this society that condemns you, that hates you, that doesn't want you to survive, that doesn't want you to do it, to grow. But jazz music and and rock and roll and rhythm and blues, it like they couldn't stop it. It was an unstoppable force, and it was so much to do with the emancipation of yourself, but even within a society that is has made you a slave. So I think that sadly the slave mentality is still very prevalent in all walks of life. I've been working on this piece of music for a documentary film about the Invaders, and which was a Memphis Black Power group in the late '60s, and actually they had the meeting with Dr. King hours before he got shot, and that meeting was where Dr. King sat down with a militant group called the Invaders, who were blamed for all of the violence that at the previous peaceful rallies in Memphis. But in fact, the truth was it was the police that started it, like they do, all like since time immemorial or whatever. But Dr. King sat down with John B. Smith, who has become like family to me, and he told him, I want the Invaders to join me and to go to all the Black Power groups, all of these, there's so many that were all over, the Young Lords, the Black Panthers, so many groups. And Martin Luther King wanted to take the Invaders, reach out to these kids and young people, and preach nonviolence and help them, better organize the great things that they were already organizing, feeding kids, teaching kids. And that's why J. Edgar Hoover wanted him dead so bad, because that was the scariest thing for them, for the FBI, and to see positive change in a place that
power back to the people from the bottom up.
Yeah, exactly. As an outsider born, on native land, in Canada, and then when I discovered music, I remember watching Otis Redding on TV or something. It was for one of those commercials for like those tape compilations of like the 1960s or whatever. I used to love those commercials, and like I remember, when they would list all the songs and stuff, and I remember seeing James Brown on there, seeing Otis Redding, and I was just like, wow, I was really very young when I was just like, what is this, and then I remember the Ramones, like I think it was Rock and Roll High School, and I saw Joey Ramone, and he was like an Elvis to me when I was a kid. I was like, what is this, So a part of my emancipation came from the discovery of rock and roll, and then later, when I was like, oh, I should try to do this, I was, and it was around the time actually that I discovered the Velvet Underground, probably, that I got that inspiration, like, oh, I want to pick up a guitar and do this too, but that decision to go into, learning how to write songs and stuff, it has to do with also that I found my tribe, as a teenager, I found a band of delinquents, from the same school, some from other, like there was some graffiti kids, I remember doing that kind of stuff. I was a very bad graffiti artist, but I used to always spray paint these cactuses and toasters and stupid things. Anyways, in that process of finding that tribe, the rock and roll was just what we wanted to play, and most people at that time were doing this kind of indie rock. But yeah, we had like
Well, that's what I love about
guiding
your
us.
music is that you can't really identify it to it. I mean, it could be from the 60s, 70s, 80s. That's got that psychedelic.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Blues married with punk.
Yeah, I feel like music is such a it's like the card of the magician is like, when you learn the tools to control your destiny, and later did I realized I was doing that the whole time. I was and I feel like there's the quality in music, that there's like there's music that's made for commercial use and for to feed the fodder, or the fodder for the masses that feed the sheep. I think that I was always attracted to, or like a magnet, I was drawn to, for example, Sun Ra. When I first discovered Sun Ra, in my early 20s, it was like a religious experience. He gives a lot about his philosophy and is basically saying, like, listen to the music that's inside of you, like the music of the spheres is within you, and play that music. Like, don't play music that's been written for you, and so yeah, so I feel like I've always followed music that has kind of this pure intention, and for example, Sun Ra, Alice Coltrane is a huge influence, like, and especially the way Alice Coltrane also adopted like the philosophies of like Buddhism and Hinduism, and unifying them into jazz. That's what I love about that world, is that I feel like there's no culture in that world. It's all the cultures. It's a a beautiful mixing of the bloods and of thoughts, and it was before this whole thing where the cancel culture thing and like people nitpicking. I feel like also comedy, I think comedy, at least for me in my voyage, has been like one of the biggest healers. I remember being a kid watching Eddie Murphy Delirious and Raw, and I couldn't believe that my parents let me rent that. You know what I mean? It's like just the swearing, it's just so enlightening. It was like it felt like you were getting away with a crime. But it was so important though, because it's like then that led me into Richard Pryor. And then when I saw Richard Pryor talk, there's like this great stuff he did in Watts Stacks, this concert that happened in Watts, LA. There's a documentary about it.
I'm gonna open up to the deck.
Oh, okay. I really feel like with comedy, you're turning your trauma into something that everyone is laughing at. And I think that's an incredibly healing thing, because even like, for example, when Richard Pryor's talking about, his accident with when he lit himself on fire, freebasing cocaine, something that is so terrible and scary and dangerous. But when he does it in this comedy and everyone's laughing at it, then we're kind of all healing in a way, So
yeah, there's something important about the inappropriate, right? And it's the comedy.
Right.
Like I was thinking the other day that comedy in a way is a doorway between the conscious and unconscious, so the appropriate and the inappropriate. And if you lose that access, if you want comedy to be appropriate all the time, it loses its power.
Exactly, and I like that's, for example. I mean, this is more an observation, but I've noticed that nowadays there's too many good-looking people who are comedians. Like I think it's an important part of like the ugly duckling process. In comedy, to grow up and feel the heat of like all these insults and being awkward and that turns into this alchemic reaction into being like the funniest comedy. But now they're just people are too good looking for comedy. Their comedy is also really like tasteless or not tasteless, but just flavorless. Actually, I would say flavorless.
Yeah. So let's get into these decks a bit. We'll start with the Black Power.
Sure.
We'll go back to the Fool. And so here we have Black Herman, right? The magician.
Yes.
And you can see that, right?
Yes. This fantastic picture you found of him.
And wow, I mean, he's just, to think of this magician who grew up, I guess, right after the time of the emancipation but was extremely successful at a time when that was extremely difficult.
Yeah, you know what's the first reason that I chose him was because Sun Ra was named after him. His biological birth name was Herman. And so in some sense I feel and he was Sun Ra's favorite magician.
Wow.
So I feel like it's interesting because it's like I feel like the magic of Herman penetrated the next generation and went into Sun Ra, you know, and Ra, you know, Sun Ra talks about how like he was kind of looking at his name Herman and he saw the word or the letters R-A pop out, you know, and then that's when he knew he had to be Ra. So yeah, and you know what's funny too, actually, just on a side note, is that Black Herman was the one who invented the game 52 Pickup.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
I know that.
and in fact, he did it because a lot of gamblers used to like to gamble against him because they knew that he was a magician. And one time someone was threatening him or saying that he was cheating, and he got pissed off, and he said like, oh, let's just play 52 Pickup, and he did it, and then like that was his exit.
Wow.
Like,
what do you suppose is?
I love that.
What is the meaning for you on the articles, which are very similar to the articles in the Marseille deck that he has on the table there? It almost looks like a bone to his next to his right hand.
Well, that was in the Marseille deck. There's like the dice, right, that are on the table.
Or 4 and 4, the numbers that are up.
Right. There's a knife that looks like a feather. What I really love, the little vagina that's underneath him on the floor.
The plant.
Yeah. Yeah, it's supposed to be like the vagina of the world.
Well, he's pulling. The magician pulls energy from above, right? Whereas, like when we get to 11, it's like pulling energy from below.
Okay.
So I mean, just my take. But so when you perform, do you feel this correlation with the magician within you?
Yes, very much so. You know what I love about Herman is that he was also like dabbling in the occult, but and mixing it slowly into his own show. I mean, part of his show was like, you know, the classic magic show that you've always, you know, we all heard of or seen, you know, since we were kids, you know, pulling he did one, I think, where he lifted his hat, there'd be a live chicken under it, and then he would put it back on, and then he would lift it up, and then there would be like a plate of scrambled eggs and fried chicken. So like, I love the way he incorporated humor into the whole thing too. But you know, in the beginning, Herman, he had kind of two different shows. He had one show that he was taking down south, you know, into he would rent a farmer's field, and like it would be exclusively Black audience that would be coming to see him, and mostly a lot of like sharecroppers and, you know, and people in you know, working in farms and stuff. But then he also had a show that he did up in the northern part, like in Chicago and New York, which was at a theater. You know, and Marcus Garvey was a big fan of his too. You know, and Herman started doing a lot of preaching during the later parts of it, like in the 20s and stuff, preaching about like supporting Black-owned businesses, and you know, like he became really like in the tradition of Marcus Garvey too. You know, he was like being about like, you know, supporting Black culture, you know, and Black people. So yeah, I really love the stories that I've read about Black Herman, and it was always Danny Ray Thompson from the Sun Ra Arkestra, who passed like I guess about a year ago. He and I would always swap tales about Black Herman whenever we would hang out. Wow. So yeah.
So we moved to Marie Laveau, the so-called sorceress of New Orleans, also born free, but earlier during the slave time. And she held these mystical, magical powers, apparently, and she practiced voodoo and was able to free some wrongfully jailed Black Americans at the time. But,
yes, and actually, there's that story that she would stand outside of the courtroom and chew hot peppers while the court proceeding was going on, and reciting her spells. So I like the image of her like with a mouthful of peppers, probably tears rolling down her eyes, mumbling some like magic, you know, hoodoo voodoo spell, you know, while this some judge probably indoors is like, you know, suddenly profusely sweating from some part of his body which he doesn't know why.
Fantastic. I love this. And then we have the Empress herself.
Yes.
Simone.
This is interesting too, because a lot of people there's like have given her the moniker of the High Priestess of Soul.
Right. Yeah.
And in a lot of ways, when I thought about she was kind of trapped in a way, and I feel like she wasn't allowed to go to the spirit mother level because she was like a prisoner of her of there was her manager and husband,
right,
who was just basically using her as a workhorse,
a police
and
he was a police officer, I believe.
Exactly, and he was the scariest police officer ever. I mean, I can't even, just the description of him like kind of terrified me. But I feel like you see in this card, like the eagle, half of the eagle on the shield is developed and then half is underdeveloped. So it's like it's to show that coming into femininity, coming into womanhood, and that's why the scepter is like coming out of her pubic area. But like
by placing her as the Empress, you're kind of, in a sense, freeing her, or at least in the archetype. I
don't know if I would say freeing her. I would just say that I feel like her thing was that she wasn't given permission or she wasn't allowed to age gracefully into, like, for example, like the High Priestess level,
right.
So I feel like she was always kind of trapped in this kind of teenage love thing in her mind and body and soul, and it was very hard for her, for example, to find partners, and then again, all like here she is, her best friends are all assassinated, like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. I mean, all these great people that she was around, and that documentary that they made about her was just so fantastic and so heart crushing, but like there's at one point where she's like, oh well, what civil rights movement? They killed everyone, and so there's this despair to her. That's very strong. But in a sense, though, I guess, okay. Now I see what you mean in terms of liberating her, but and giving her the Empress name, because yes, at her she was this like powerhouse of like femininity, and just such an important catalyst for change.
It seemed like, from what I've read, she had difficulty in her relationship with her daughter.
Yes, exactly. So she didn't get to be the right spirit mother,
right.
And also, her whole getting medicated and all this kind of stuff, that was a very, it hindered her from aging gracefully, let's say.
Right. Reverend Johnny Jones, right?
Yes, Johnny L. Jones, the hurricane that hit Atlanta. I
love this way of talking where they called him the hurricane because his energy builds during the sermon, right, in Atlanta. But he says his power comes when it comes back down, like a
totally. I have a very good friend of mine in New Orleans. His name is Julian. When he was 15, he was living in, I think he was born and raised in New Orleans. Anyway, when he was a teenager, he was into like playing drums. He wanted to be a metal drummer. But then he saw a advertisement on the, like on the wall somewhere, and took the phone number, and it was a reverend from a black church looking for a drummer to play during his sermons. So Julian, just out of, for curiosity's sake, he was like, oh, I'll try that out. So then he takes the number, calls him up, and he gets invited to the church to practice. And the preacher, is telling him about, like, okay, when I say make it rain, I want you to, get on the cymbals, make a little sizzle, and then when I say thunder, I want you to smash, like hit the floor tom. He's giving him the instructions for the preparation. And then on the Sunday, then his first time performing with him, during the sermon, and like this was a really small church in a Baptist church in New Orleans. So like the women, especially the old ladies in the audience, like the old black ladies, they would like get up and dance and start wandering around, and like there's tambourines, and then sometimes the women would get up on the stage and like go up like near Julian, play drums, and like and it totally freaked him out. Like he was like, he decided not to continue with it. And then a few weeks later, after he hadn't shown up, the preacher came over to Julian's house and he had a convertible car, and in the car was this like gigantic black velvet, and the preacher rings the doorbell and talks to his mom and dad, and he was like, hey, we'd really like Julian to come back and join us at church, and as a token of our appreciation, here's this couch that you guys can have.
Oh man.
But anyway, sorry, that's just a funny story. But Johnny L. Jones, he comes from that world, of wild, incredible preaching, and I mean, there's countless hours of recordings of his, from his church that, it's just magnificent, and gospel music has been one of the very big influences on me too. Reverend Louis Overstreet, the Reverend Julius Cheeks is also a great one. Charlie Jackson. There's just tons, and I feel like the power in that music is just, imagine you're living a life, of an African American in this world, in this America, even in modern America. I mean, the past 400 years have been pretty fucked up. But imagine on Sunday when that door opens up, and then there's this preacher named Utah Smith. And I was reading about him, and Utah Smith, he's from New Orleans. I think he was preaching in the 30s. He had angel wings made, of feathers that were strapped to him. And then those were connected to a pulley system, and they would hoist him in the air. And then he would swing over the audience and sing hallelujah, and with a guitar.
I want to go to church.
Exactly. And actually, if you do the math, it's like if Utah Smith was around it was preaching around in the 30s or something. That means that, for example, the young Aaron Neville and all these all the people who became giants in New Orleans R&B, they were probably children watching exactly this, and
it's the opposite of Screaming Jayhawk.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Which makes sense. So I skipped 4. But before we get into, now that we're on 5, the Pope Court or the Hierophant, maybe you can give some background about your relationship with Jodorowsky, who restored the Marseille deck. And I know he influenced a lot this deck, and you got his approval for the images and such. So maybe you could talk about how you met him. And
so, I discovered his films, I guess I was 21, 22. And just, I've always said that I have this bar of expectation from art, that if art does not mutate me, then it doesn't work for me, and so
how do you know if it mutates you?
It's as soon as you experience it, whether it be a song, a painting, a movie, or anything, that you feel changed.
So it's got to be instantaneous. Something has to initiate.
Something. I mean, it could just be riotous laughter as a reaction, but it has to have changed my biology. I mean, there's a lot of art that when I see it, I feel nothing. And most of the art that there's been lots of art. For example, Man Ray was one thing when I discovered when I was 16. It was the first book that I bought at a museum. And I was it's just out of all the books that were there, this black and white photography book just spoke to me so much. So there's. When I discovered Holy Mountain and El Topo, it completely, I felt changed. I felt like my biology had changed, and my whole interpretation of the world, just was blown open, And so then that year, I think it was 2000 or 2001, I played a show in the south of France, and Sophie Crum was in the audience, and she was a volunteer at this festival, and I met her. She was a couple years younger than me. And we just started talking. We had painted something together for fun, and then we were just gabbing, and I didn't know who she was or where she came from. So she told me about, I'm from San Francisco and expatriate, blah, blah, blah. And then finally figured out that it was, she told me, it was funny. She told me about her uncle in San Francisco who eats that thread and pulls it out of his ass.
Oh, wow.
It's it's a yoga or Ayurvedic practice. So and that, in an interview in the Crumb documentary that was out years before that, I remember that it's an amazing part of the interview. It's either I think it's Max Crumb or Charles Crumb, one of his brothers. Anyway, so when she said, I asked her oh, you have family in San Francisco, and she's like, yeah, I have a weird uncle there. And I was like, why is he so weird? And then she said, oh, well, he eats this thread and pulls it out of his ass. And then I was laughing. I was like, oh my, sounds exactly like, Robert Crumb's brother. And she's like, yeah, that's my uncle. And I was like, that means that you know Robert Crumb. She's like, yeah, it's my dad. I'm like, oh my God. Like my mouth just dropped. Because Robert Crumb was also the same with him. His art, when I discovered that in 17, I didn't feel like a lost, lonely sheep or I don't know, I never felt like a lost, lonely sheep, but a lost, lonely animal. I mean, like it was so heartwarming to see that, oh, other people think this way, and like, and I remember a lot of my friends at that time, as a teenager, we all loved comics and especially Robert Crumb and like, that whole world, Freak Brothers, like all that crazy LSD comic world. Anyways, sorry, to go back to Jodorowsky. So I was talking to Sophie about a bunch of stuff, and I asked her if she knew Jodorowsky because I figured maybe families had known each other or something. And she was telling me, oh, I just went to a tarot reading that he does every Sunday at this club, at this cafe. And I was like, what? I didn't know he did tarot. And she's like, yeah, he's like really into it. And like, and there's all these like old ladies that wake up really early to get a number at the cafe, so that when they show up later on, maybe like they'll get a chance for him to do their cards. So that intrigued me. And then I was like, oh, okay, cool. And then at the same moment, I was asked to be a part of this art collective in Berlin. And they gave me a small room and they're like, do whatever you want. And I was like, oh, I'm going to do tarot, like Jodorowsky. I'm just going to, I had no idea about it. I didn't even have a deck of cards. So I show up in Berlin and then I asked, I scrambling, asked my friend, hey, does anyone have any tarot cards? And so my friend had this deck of the Aleister Crowley deck, but in German. And I didn't know German, so I couldn't even read what the words were on the cards. I didn't know what, So imagine how hokey it is. I had also made a turban, like a giant turban. And funny enough, I had this flag I made a Black Panther flag and I hung that up. So it was kind of like, this was 20 years before, or 15 years before the Black Power Tarot even existed, but it was already in its kind of shaping up, So like I had this big Black Panther flag and then these Aleister Crowley deck, and I was doing tarot for people, and I had made up my own way of reading. I was doing it blindly, but in that same sense, doing it blind was how suddenly I felt the light of it, and I just was doing readings, and most of the people that I was reading for were like, wow, you really know how to do this, like you're talking about things that are really that apply to me, so that just made me feel like, okay, I got to spend more time and learn this, and so I started I go obsessing over. I would do, if someone's going to the dentist, I'd do your tarot cards, I was obsessed. I do the tarot cards for Mickey Mouse. I just do anything, just to learn what they were. But this is when I was using the whole 78, so, yeah. And then let's say fast forward till, I guess, let's see, it's been about 10 years since I've been doing the Invaders soundtrack. So, I got this gig to make the soundtrack of this film, which unfortunately hasn't been released yet, but hopefully it'll be released this year. But civil rights documentary about this group, the Invaders, from Memphis. So when I started doing the music for this, I was working hand in hand with the director, for years. I mean, literally it was probably 8 years of back and forth, tightening things, we're working on songs, and the imagery that I was bathing in, was like the really heavy imagery of civil rights. So you got Martin Luther King's wake. I'd never seen this footage, this the archival footage from University of Memphis. I get to see all this stuff and then put music to it, and it was an honor because it was like the director played my music to John B. Smith, who was one of the founding members of the Invaders. And he said, oh my God, this music sounds like the music we were listening to when we started doing our revolution stuff back then, the Black Power movement. And I was so beyond honored. But then he was the one who's like, hey, ask King Khan to do the whole soundtrack, and so that opened the door for, so many beautiful things, followed from that, I became really close with John B, and so while I was watching all this footage, I had a dream of Jodorowsky. This was the second dream I'd have of Jodorowsky. And this is before I'd met him and worked with him. But this dream I had was I was like hanging out with him in a kind of like a university kind of setting, and I was trying to talk to him, and he had like a 3 or 4 day old beard and like and looked kind of drunk and long haired and like just kind of disheveled, and I couldn't get in touch with him because whenever I would go up to him, some woman would come and take him away, some French woman. And then finally, in like the middle or end of the dream, he came up to me and he just looked at me. He was like, "Show me a card. That is weird." And I was like, what? Like, and I was frustrated, because I was the whole dream I'm trying to talk to him, but and I'm like, a card that is weird. And so like I look in my pocket and I pull out this card, and this tarot card, and then we're both looking at it, and we'd never seen this card before, and we were both like nodding, like, yes, that is weird, right? So then when I woke up from that dream, that's when I knew that I had to make the Black Power Tarot, and it was I just knew the path, and then it took me good 2 years to like figure out all who I wanted to wear and all this kind of stuff and how it should look, and then. And then during that process, I got the artist, Michael Eaton, called me up or emailed me and was just like, "Hey, I do art for the Game of Thrones. And also I love, music, and I love your music. And if you ever want to do project or merchandise or whatever." And I was like, oh my God, this guy is the perfect dude. He's like, does stuff Game of Thrones. He does like these ancient fucking flags and, that kind of stuff for the Game of Thrones, or like old books in the Game of Thrones. And on the other side, he does these portraits of like, Captain Beefheart and, all these blues legends. And anyways, so I was just like, okay, I found this guy. And funny enough too, 6 years before he contacted me, the first time I played Belfast, I went in the audience and I randomly went up to him and gave him a huge bear hug and then went back on stage. And he only told me this like a couple of years ago. So it was funny. Like 6 years before, I already knew that he was the one that was gonna,
Wow.
that we were gonna do something like that. But again, going back to Jodorowsky. So yeah, I reached out to Yodo, and I was playing a wedding in I don't remember what year, but I guess early 2000s. I was playing a wedding. I was doing the song for the bride and groom to dance to. And I did this country song called Man in Love by Charlie Feathers. And I started singing this country song. And then this guy randomly came up on stage and starts playing bass, ding, 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 ding. And he was playing really good. So I was like, not complaining. I just said, okay, cool. I don't know who this guy is, but it's fun. And then I get off stage and he comes up to me and he's like, "Hey, I'm Adnan Jodorowsky." And I'm like, "What?" I'm like, "Oh my God." And then I'm like, "Your dad is like my guru, I love him, he's just like, he's changed my life, and Adnan was really super nice, and he was a fan of my music, and he was like, "You know what, man, if you ever want to meet him, I will totally hook it up for you, and like it would be my pleasure," and I was like, oh my God, I'm not worthy. Like, I was like, I actually waited like 3 years to take him up on that invitation because I didn't feel like I was prepared enough to meet him at that point. And then finally, after 3 years, like I was in Paris and with the Almighty Defenders, and Yodo wrote to me, and he was, and I loved his email. Was like, it wasn't just like, "Oh yeah, come over," It was like, "Come to the door, push the button, I will be waiting for you." It's like this. I could like read his email in his Jodorowsky Holy Mountain voice.
Yeah, you're in the middle of the mountain there.
Yeah, it totally. And so. Yeah, so I was in Paris. I went to his house, and I get there and there's like this ancient elevator, like with the gears, all, like, and I get in the elevator and then like it's going up and it's got like, and I hear him from the third floor, like, "Troisième, troisième," like, I'm on the third floor, like, and I get there and then the elevator opens up and he's like, "Oh, I didn't know that the elevator worked." Like, so that was the first magic thing that happened. The old elevator seemed to work for us, but yeah. And so we sat down together in his office, and I brought Cole from the Black Lips there, from the Black Lips, the band. And when I told him on the way there, I was like, "You're just going to keep your mouth shut. You're not going to say anything unless people ask you." Cause I was like, I've been waiting meet, Yodo for so long, and like I didn't want to bring anyone at first, but then he was begging me, and I was like, okay, you know what? I love you. You're like a son to me. And we used to call each other father and son all the time, being cool. And so then when Yodo invites us in, and then he's like, show me your cards. I show him this Rider-Waite deck that I was using for a long time that I got in Mexico City. And he was like, okay, that's not your deck anymore. This is the deck you're going to use. So he goes and pulls out the Tarot de Marseille. And then he's like, but for our work, he's like, we're going to use just the Major Arcana. And I was like, wow, like that, just that alone, it felt like it was like kind of a tumor from my back or something, and like, and it was just a simple thing. It's just like, if you want a direct message of how you can, follow the path of illumination, then just use the Major Arcana. And that's very, very direct. And, I mean, like 78 cards is a lot, and that's why when I made the Black Power Tarot, I just made the Major Arcana, and so I think I must have sat down with him for a few hours. It must have been like 2 or 3 hours. It felt like he's explaining all these things to me, showing me these really cool things. Like if you like put the Fool and the Nameless or Death card on top of each other, and you move it sideways, it's actually there. It's an X-ray of each other. Like, anyways, it's showing me all these wonderful things, and then from then on, I was writing to him. Sending him poetry, sending him I made a video in tribute to him called Born to Die, which he really enjoyed. And so we had this discourse going on, and like whenever I would write something interesting that he would like, he would respond and talk about, like what's going on. And when I told him that I wanted to do the Black Power deck, he was like really, really very enthusiastic about it. And he was like, this is amazing. It's a great idea, and so I asked him to supervise it, and so I, when we got all the drawings, I was sending them to him to get approved, and he would, and remarkably, we got 18 out of, 22 right, like off the bat. There was like 5 that we had to change things, and and the process was wonderful too, like he was adamant about me not using my ego, so like, for example, the Judgment card, the original Judgment card I had was the NWA, and I had like all of the rappers in NWA like standing above and then there's the blue androgynous angel that comes out. So that was Eazy-E, right? And so I thought that I mean, and the thing was, I was using my ego to make that card entertaining to me. I wasn't tapping into the essence of the card. I just thought it would be.
You felt
that?
Yeah,
right away. He was just like, no, wrong. He's like, that's not Judgment, and he's like, think about what the card is about, and Judgment card is, for me, is like, it was one of the most powerful ones in the deck because it's about the emergence of the androgynous super being, and it's like Judgment is the one at the end of the trip, right? Like it's the card before the world, so it's like it's the most concentrated power in this card. Because it's like the whole voyage of your path of illumination has culminated to this one card now, which is right before total understanding of the world. And here you have the emergence of this incredible being, right? This blue being, which is half man, half woman. So it's basically that after the long path of illumination and all this learning you do, you finally are able to shed the skin of sexuality and look at things from a higher perspective, from an androgynous super being perspective, right?
Wow, that's really cool. I always like the image of where it looks like the person's hair is almost like an egg or an embryo or some early.
Yeah.
The mountain.
The weird bagel crown.
Yeah. And then it looks like it's inside the womb of that beige mountain behind it, or yellow mountain.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
So what made you choose Erykah Badu?
I just thought of Erykah Badu and Andre 3000 as two people or two artists for me who always kind of blur the lines of sexuality. Like they're not your traditional male and female roles. They're very kind of these complicated artists that are like always kind of swimming around in multiverses or whatever, especially of sexuality. So I just imagine that their procreations, their children, must be also in this like amazing kind of like like the emergence of this super being, you know, like they're children that are born into a family that is not going to force them to be, you know, to decide whether you're male or female, but in fact celebrate like your voyage, you know, finding out all the different sides. So I feel like Andre 3000 and Erykah Badu, as I think that they're you know, really a couple also for a while that, like, you know, had multiple children, I think. So yeah, I felt like they would be a good to be on this card.
Yeah, it goes to this idea that you don't, as you know, and I know from being parents, you don't really have control, or if you do have control, that's not a healthy thing, over who your children are. You just get to hold space and be a container for that. And that seems like what they're doing.
Exactly. Yeah, and I feel like they're probably really excellent parents of that. Yeah. You know, actually, that's one thing. It's nice that you say it that way, because like my children now, they're like 18 and 20, you know, and I get a lot of hope from seeing their peers, you know, and I feel like, especially it's a lot of young women that I get to meet through my kids that they're you know, they're friends, and it's amazing how comfortable they are in their skin and in their bodies and minds. Because I remember, you know, I don't know how old you are, but I'm 44.
Same age.
How old are you?
Same
age?
Yeah.
Cool. It's the drunk year. You see double. Yeah. So like I just remember my voyage, you know, when we were kids, it was not, you know, homosexuality was something that was, you know, shunned, or like, you know, it was a huge deal if someone was gay. So yeah, it gives me a lot of hope to see how advanced young kids are, you know, or certain young kids are with respect to that. And yeah, and you know, it's just like we owe a lot to homosexuals. You know, like Burroughs, for example, for me was a huge influence, because I started reading his books also just because Naked Lunch the film came out in Canada, and I saw a commercial for it, and like I think I must have been 15 or something, and I went to my teacher and I was like, "What's Naked Lunch?" And my English teacher was like, "Oh, go out and buy it and read it right away," without hesitation, you know, and that completely changed my life. Like I never, you know, I had such a like I had no idea about what sexuality was at that age, you know, that grade.
I never read it. I'm going to write that down.
Oh man, you got to read it. It's like, actually, you know what, you should check out. I've done I've put music to recitations of Naked Lunch.
Oh wow.
You can, yeah, it's called Let Me Hang You. You can find it on my Bandcamp. There's a personal connection to Burroughs that's really important for me that I gotta tell you about. Was that so when my father was this raging drug addict, a cocaine addict, when I was like that same age, when I discovered Burroughs, I bought this copy of Naked Lunch, and like in the beginning of the first chapter was an introduction, and it was talking about drug addiction, and it was Burroughs analyzing drug addiction and stuff. And when I read that, it was the first glimpse of where I suddenly realized that I had empathy for my father, who was on this drug trip, you know. And instead of me just going outright hating him and blaming him for, you know, ruining our family or something like that, I instead was kind of fascinated by his decisions or choices that led him into this crazy, twisted world, you know. So for me, when I was reading Naked Lunch, you know, it like these graphic scenes of like cannibalism and sex and homosexual sex and every you know, just this crazy world, you know, and it was like just tearing my mind. I have to describe it as like leaving an ooze, you know, and it's an ooze that like I'll tap into a lot if I, you know, in moments where I need to be inspired. I can always go to that place in my brain where I remember, you know, as a child, you know, like witnessing this book and absorbing it, and it really shaping me.
Wow. Well, let's go to the most. I was like, there's no way we're actually going to go from 0 to 21. That's
right.
So, in honor of that, let's go back to 15, the most androgynous card in the deck, the Devil or Spirit.
Yes.
And wow, I mean, you took a lot from him as well in the way.
Yes, very much so. I think that Screaming Jay Hawkins, I think, also was one of these people who was very much an outsider, you know, his whole life. I mean, just his birth, the way his birth happened. I mean, his mother, you know, apparently had lots of affairs with many different men in the city that she was living in, and then she got driven out by the women, you know, and like was basically beaten up and put on a bus to go somewhere, and she was 9 months pregnant at the time, and so yeah, Screaming Jay was born like in Cleveland or something after she got off the bus, running away from her home. But yeah, so Screaming Jay, there's his laugh, his like celebration of his innards. He sees from all parts of his body. Constipation blues comes from the belly. But I feel like the most amazing thing Jay is that he wasn't afraid of creating. A lot of people nowadays, or back in the artists sometimes are fearful of rocking the boat too much, or and I feel like
that can go both directions, right? I mean, that it's not just about being accepted means different things in different times.
Right. Exactly. But with Screaming Jay, I feel like he loved the absurd. He loved cracking shit jokes and all sorts of stuff. And there's also something about his laugh that I just find so like.
Well, he was brought up, I think, in part by Native American.
Yes, that's another thing. Yeah.
And but I know traditionally, and I can't speak for all of Native America, but in certain tribes and cultures, the shaman role was held by people who held androgynous, or perhaps what we think of as gay leanings.
Right, the two spirits, or the two spirits, or the heyoka you're talking about too, which is like the trickster shaman.
Yes.
Yeah, actually, that's a very big. It really blew my mind how, like, I think it was in Lakota tribes where, like, when the warriors would come back from battle and they would have PTSD and would be like riddled with this kind of traumatic experiences, then they would have these nightmares, and they would tell the shaman or the heyoka about the dreams, and then the heyoka would reenact the dream in front of the warrior, and that act of like making the trauma into laughter was part of the healing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the key in all this, and so much about the tarot is to externalize it, to get it out, to give it dimensionality.
Exactly.
And it's not that being androgynous is more enlightened per se. It's like this idea of getting beyond the habitual or the framework of what's been passed down, so that you're an autonomous being.
Yeah. I think there's something in the Mayan calendar where like it's like talking about nowadays as being when the snake sees through the eyes of the eagle. Mm-hmm. Have you heard of this?
I don't.
I think it's supposed to describe now, and it's supposed to be a reference to how like the people of the North will see through the eyes of the people of the South, like from the North Pole and South Pole. Like it's basically that now is the time where we are really witnessing like the ability to see through the eyes of others.
Right.
And I truly feel that, and you feel the negative aspects of that too, in terms of like, for example, with internet, how all these walls have been broken now, and you can contact anyone, you can, conjure anyone, but with that comes, this hefty price that you have to pay, which is, for example, like, these anti-vaxxers and these crazy conspiracy nuts, that are making our world
cocoon yourself in your own beliefs, in your own echo chamber, and really
exactly
have a more segmented society. Whereas like you would think that a free exchange of information would create more unity, but it's in a way it can do the opposite too.
But it has, for example, especially for example, the First Nations, like the Standing Rock was the first time that all of the tribes of America actually physically got together, to fight against. That's amazing, and you see it now too, like, with the Idle No More movement that was happening, or that is happening in Canada, which is the first time that all these First Nations, and it's very women driven, and it's amazing. Oh yeah, see, and that'll bring us into the Dots and Feathers tarot world. But
I just started looking at this week. I mean, wow, it's so interesting. So was this was created after the Black Power?
Yes, yeah.
And you're working with the images. You chose these images as well.
I had 8 consultants that I work with. Two of them were a son from Montreal, from my hometown, who are Mohawk, and they're both healers. And so Mike Standup was really a close brother of mine. He actually did some dowsing for me when I was kind of going through some really heavy psychological times. And so, yeah, so I had him and his mother are both healers. They serve both, like, indigenous First Nations people, but also, like, I think half their clients are probably like white and other cultures, but they have this, like, they carry on the tradition of the traditional Mohawk healing, but they also mix it in with their own kind of ideas and practices, and so I sent them all of my selections for the cards. And I have a very wonderful sister of mine who's Osage Indian from Oklahoma. Mm-hmm. And I sent her the selections, and yeah, I sent it to a bunch of really great people. She's actually, the way I got in touch with her, which is funny, is her cousin is in the cards, Maria Tallchief.
Oh yes.
And the prima ballerina, and yeah, it's just like, I felt like this was really important, and especially, now that, like, you see with COVID, a lot of the elders are passing away, and so I just felt like, in the same way as the Black Power Tarot is that, we're picking these, like, 22 or let's say 26 people to just show the path of illumination, also to celebrate their lives, these great people, but also to put the lives of these people into your heart and soul, and to, and let them heal you in some sense.
I was thinking, as you're talking, just the irony and the absurdity, actually, of the fact that these people were called Indians, and they just left it. They just left it.
Yeah.
Like, baseball teams called Indians, and like, how could you possibly disgrace two people even more, two nations even more?
That's really, it's funny they say that too, because, like, when I was a teenager and I was like, when I used to get kicked out of my house sometimes from my dad, I would actually go and move in with one of my best Mohawk friends on the reservation, and that was like an ongoing joke, was like, hey, I'm the real Indian here. But
it's amazing. It's the reception been from people in the Black American, North American communities, and people from.
It's been great. It's been great. I mean, so far, the Dots and Feathers just came out, but I have had word from, like, especially the people that helped me make it. They love it. There's some contemporary artists that are in the Dots and Feathers. Like, there's Kwana Style, who's like a amazing Cree artist, and she's in it, and she's two-spirited, and her card is the tower in the deck. And then there's also Tanya Tagak and Lakuluk, who are two Inuk artists who are in there, and Buffy Sainte Marie is the star, So I got blessings from all of them to be in the deck, and Buffy Sainte Marie for me also I'm, like, so proud to be, from the same place that, she's just, like, such an incredible activist her whole life, and if you go down that rabbit hole of, like, looking for her performances, I mean, Newport Folk Festival, like, with Bob Dylan, all in black and white, there she is singing about morphine, just, like, really, oh no, sorry, she's singing about codeine. Yeah. Mm. And actually, there's one song of hers that it just, like, goes right into my heart, is called He's the Keeper of the Fire. And it's there's a live version, and then there's the recorded version. The recorded version sounds like the 13th Floor Elevators are backing her up, and that's one of my all-time favorite psychedelic bands. But this song is just about, like, this, this voodoo man that comes out of the mist, and he's the keeper of the fire. Yeah, you should just check it out. It's just very, very spiritually healing.
The Irish artist you used for the Black Power deck, did he help you with this?
Michael Eaton.
Yeah.
Michael Eaton. Yeah. We have a great relationship. Like I said, 6 years before we actually did constructive work together, I went out and bear hugged him randomly in Belfast. And it's funny because back then Belfast was already socially distanced. Like, in the audience, people were always standing like a meter away from each other, and I didn't know why. I was just like, oh, this is strange, so then what I did was I took the microphone cable and I did a big circle around the audience, and then I ran on stage and I yanked the cable super hard, and everyone just started toppling over and falling on each other. And then they started dancing. That was so. Hey, sometimes you need to
break. You
need to hog tie the white man.
Oh man, that's fantastic. Do you think you could pull a card for 2 cards for me? See what comes
Yeah.
up?
Well, normally my favorite is always a 3 card reading. So like, give me 3 numbers from 1 to 22.
Okay. 6, 11, 18.
6.
I'll pull the cards up if you label them.
Okay. The Emperor. Ooh, the Hangman. And the Hermit. That's interesting.
So the Emperor and the Hermit, the Hangman and the Hermit are out of order.
The Emperor, the Hangman, and the Hermit. Let's start with the Hangman in the middle. It's about the deep meditation, right? That this Hangman has chosen to tie himself to this branch and observe the world differently from everyone else, right? So they also say, Jodorowsky says that the Hangman is actually the one that's in the egg of the High Priestess.
Yeah, I always think of it as the fetus card because of like upside down.
Right. The stargazer fetus. Yeah. So I always like to see the Hangman as basically, you're hanging upside down, you're observing the world, and you're not concerned with winning or losing, you're just concerned with being, right? So the reading here, now the Emperor in this is the first card you chose, and it's looking away from the Hangman, right? So it's turning its back kind of on the Hangman. So and the Hermit as the third card is actually looking towards the Hangman and looking at the light. I guess in some ways that maybe I would see this reading as the Emperor turning his back. So it's like the Emperor, for example, is my birth card, right? Maybe it's like we're putting the ego of the aside and we're talking more about the meditative, goodness and getting to the nitty-gritty and not worrying about like the emperor-ish issues, right? And then this corresponds to like the hermit is staring directly into the light, like towards the meditator, towards the hangman. So yeah, I what I see here is that we're looking deeper into the voyage of my illumination, my decolonization, and the emperor is looking the other way because it's not we set the ego aside and now we're working with the tools of healing. To be honest, my favorite, I don't look so much at the numerology of the whole thing. I see it as like a visual experience. Like when I'm seeing the three cards laid next to each other, it's like a painting itself, and I'm trying to see the story that's being told visually from the way the characters are standing, the way they're looking at each other, what card is energizing the other card, And so for me, yeah, it's very important to look at that or interpret it in that sense, and I find, it's so precise and I don't want to, I always try to skirt away from saying anything like psychic or, like mumbo jumbo magic kind of stuff. But the more I do the cards and the more, I've been offering people readings, and it's just like, for example, if just a few weeks ago, a person who contacted me to read the cards, she had had a meeting with her therapist, like right before our session, and she still had tears in her eyes. And I was like, are you crying? And then she's like, oh, I just had a really great breakthrough with my therapist. I was like, oh, well, that's good news, So then I read her cards, and there was like one card, for example, I think it was the High Priestess, was like looking away from everything else. And I told her, it seems that your compassion is, directed towards something else. And I think that I thought that it was creating maybe a blockage or something, or the fact that she's, her compassion is distracted in another direction than the other cards that she had. Anyway, and then she was like freaking out because she's like, oh my God, I just did hours of therapy when that was basically what my therapist said as well. which was just a few minutes before, on the whatever. So yes, I feel like there's a really a great practical use for these cards, and to learn how to read them, and another thing too is just like I get a lot of Black women, contact me and just being so excited. They're like, I never thought I would see my own skin tone in tarot, and that's just a very, very like, what do you call it? Like a bit of a level. I mean, when you look at the actual people that I've chosen for the cards, that gives you just an even more deeper understanding of those cards,
It's so powerful. One of the questions I always ask my guests is, how do you see or feel about your own death? What is your relationship with your inevitable passing or transformation in this life?
That's an interesting thing to be honest, I love life, and I've been really blessed that I followed my heart, and I've been married 20 years, and my children are young women now, going into university and really bright and beacons of light, and I'm really proud, that, like, for example, both my daughters, they know basically how to read tarot cards, even though, at first it was like when they were kids. I mean, I was doing it around them all the time. I wasn't doing their tarot per se, but like they would be sitting there, perching and watching when I was doing tarot for other people, and and so it seeps in, and so I mean, I don't know how often they even do it, for themselves, but like they know everyone in those cards, and like they know who that music belongs to, and I just feel like when I was young, I mean, I was 20 or something, or 22 when me and my wife had the kids, and I didn't know anything about being a dad. I didn't know anything about the transferring passion and love, into these vessels, and what's amazing was that and something that I learned from Sophie Crumb, because I asked her, I was like, did Robert Crumb hide his art from you as a child? Because some of it is like risque or whatever, and she was like, no, it was everywhere. It was everywhere in the house, and so I chose to follow that guide, and I was like, I'm not going to hide anything from the kids, including I would tell them openly about my all my drug use, and I was just open about everything, and it comes back to you. It's beautiful, and now they're really amazing human beings. And so in fact, for me, the idea of death, it doesn't bother me. Like, I mean, obviously I would be sad not to see my grandchildren or something like that, but what doesn't sadden me is because I me and my wife, we transported, our love, our passion for the world, our enlightenment onto these beings, that are our children, and they will do the same thing with theirs. So like we set a precedence for the good transfer of this energy. So if I did suddenly disappear, and exploded or spontaneously combusted, there my big smile, like a smile in like slime. The residue that will be left, from my existence will just be like, or like just like a middle finger, the outline of a middle finger. No, so yeah, what I'm trying to say is that I'm very happy with the choices that I made in my life, and even the hardships. I cherish every moment, and if suddenly life was choked out of me, and I would be okay with what I've left for the world.
That's so beautiful. Is it a new discovery for you and your wife with your kids at the age they are, that you're able to put so much energy back into each other?
This is kind of funny because, like, like when I mean, my older daughter Savalu, when she left, she moved into her own apartment at 17, which was the age I also left my parents.
Well, we were talking about how in your relationship now, there's all this potential and space and time to invest back in each other, as opposed to, when you're
well, yeah, like they teach me now, it's like, I remember one funny example, for example, there's like one of the most amazing and wildest songs ever recorded was this song called Shout Bamalama, by Otis Redding.
Uh-huh.
And in that song, in some of the lyrics, there's a whole passage about the preacher and the bear, and like it's about the preacher and the bear meet late one night, like anyway. So that single I used to play on the record when my kids were like in their diapers, and they would just be shaking and dancing, and like it's one of the greatest recordings ever made. And actually, I believe that the band it was Little Richard's band, or from Orleans, the New Orleans, the Upsetters or something. Anyways, it's just balls out one of the greatest rock and roll songs ever. So like I showed this song to them as a kid, and they grew up with the song. It's like on rotation, and then a few years back, Sabalu is like, "Oh, Papa, check this out," and then she went and found gospel song that was the original Preacher of the Bear story, and then learned it and plays it, and is playing it for me, and I'm just like exploding with love, and I'm just like, oh my god, like, first the fact that she found this song, she went over and shows me, and then I think she must have been like 17 or something when she showed this to me, and then I'm rewinding in my own mind, and I'm remembering when I was her age, and I was hanging out with I ran away from home, and I started living downtown and started hanging out with my punk band friends, my family, my chosen family, who basically became my family for the rest of my life. Like all of those guys that I played with as a teenager, and one of them is my brother-in-law, married my sister. They have, 2 children of their own. So it's like music was always very, very close to like real family for me. And so, yeah, it made me really trip at the fact that like now I'm hanging out with my kid, and then she's showing me songs that are blowing my mind. And yeah, it somehow just all comes really back like down home feeling, and I remember that when I was her age, I was doing the same thing with my friends, and we were dismantling punk songs and or like, figuring out all this kind of stuff together, and yeah, so it's funny. Time history kind of repeats itself in a sense, but at the same in a sense, it's not repeating itself. It's actually just evolving into a deeper, more soulful love experience, like.
Wow. That's so beautiful. What made you, by the way, what made you feel like you wanted to stay in Berlin, that was the place for you?
So I moved here 15 years ago with my wife and the kids. And basically before that, we were living in a smaller town in Kassel, Germany. That's where I met, when I started the Shrines. And, my first, I moved there, I was like 22. And Kassel is quite a small town, and I guess in some sense, I felt like I just outgrown it in my mind, and I wanted to go to Berlin, and I've always loved Berlin. One thing I loved about Berlin was the relaxed atmosphere, that it reminded me exactly of how I grew up in Montreal, where the cost of living is not that expensive, so you can afford to actually slack off, and invest your time in art and whatever, music or whatever you want to do. So, and that sadly, that's one of the fundamental rights has been stolen from everyone now. It's like every fucking city now is so expensive, and that's choking the arts. It's like, if you don't have the chance to sit on a curb and drink a beer in a paper bag and contemplate life, then you are being robbed of something.
I know what you mean. And that, like here in the States, all the artists moving out to the suburbs and the country now, which is great in the sense that they get to connect with nature more so, but you're also more secluded from each other. And it's harder to develop a sense of community that you need to reverberate and bounce off. So it's like, it's only,
I kind of see that in a different way too, though, that I feel like the return to the land is very important. And in fact, I think that this is a move that hasn't happened forever. It was always that it was usually the poor people that were getting pushed out to the suburbs or to other, this pandemic, for example, really it shook a lot of, it shook the foundations of everything, of thought, of life, and the behavior of ignorant humanity. It's like leaving a very dark, stain on history, right? And it's getting worse. It's not getting better. So for me, if you are able now, before it was always like the rich people coming in and invading the downtowns. Now they're running to the hills, right? Like the Iron Maiden song. But so I don't know what's gonna happen in the next while, but like I personally, I mean, I'm bipolar. I'm heavily medicated, so like it's not easy for me to be cooped up in the house. Although, I have been a hermit, a lot. So I do stay home a lot and work a lot. But yeah, I mean, just the idea of just going outside and then looking around and like seeing a bunch of 10 people play basketball without any masks on, during infectious disease, lockdown. Like, what the fuck are these people thinking? Or even
people in denial.
Yeah, I don't know what's going to happen. It's like, even for example, live music. For me, my whole career was based on live music. Like performing live. It was like, because it's one thing of recording, but then the ritual and the magic of a live live show, where the energies are swirling around you. You're conjuring, you're taking these people on a trip, you're healing, you're also just making people dance and opiating their minds and letting them forget about all the hardships in their life, and they're suddenly unified, and like we're breathing and sweating, and this is such a ritual. I think because like I think we're at the cusp now. Obviously now, like, if we're not protecting nature, it's over. Like we're fucking everything up permanently. You know what I mean? So, my sister, for example, she's like on the forefront of like the front lines of this battle in Canada. She's like working for the David Suzuki Foundation, which is like kind of like it's an incredible organization that's like trying to change policies to protect, and like one of the things that she told me about was she blossomed into my brain was the idea of decolonizing nature, to stop this exploitation of nature and actually decolonize it, and and learn to love nature again, like our First Nation brothers and sisters did, in the beginning.
I think of nature as something that we have dominion over. But
yeah, exactly. And it's so important, we have to look at, and like I see her, she's a lawyer, and she's just like, writing articles and fighting against like all these different aspects of like environmental peril that needs to be addressed, and then I'm in this whole process, I'm learning so much, I'm learning about environmental racism. That's a very important thing. And right now, actually in Canada, they're making this bill against environmental racism. What happened in Flint, Michigan is a perfect example, and like basically, all these like clean water the dirty water is being siphoned off to like the poor people, the black people, the indigenous people, like they get the shit end of the stick in every respect of like, we're even in fucking prohibition of alcohol and drugs. We have to decolonize our addiction. That the term addiction has to be colonized, because there's all of these traumas that our ancestors have gone through, and I know that about this, like intergenerational trauma, and this is a very important thing to address now, because we all are victims of this. Being a stranger, born in Canada, and then there was 5 people in my high school that were Indian, right? Like Indian from India, so like we were really a strange animal to like finding my path of illumination, through music, Sun Ra, through Black rhythm and blues and free jazz, and the Black Power movement. Like I was 12 when I read Martin Luther King's, Malcolm X's autobiography, and it resonated for me till now. Like I there's no part of me that isn't, a Black Power advocate. And in fact, like the Malcolm X card is one that is really one of my favorite cards, in the Wheel of Fortune, right? And in this card, you see there's three stages of Malcolm in this card. Here, we can pull it up here. Yeah, here we go. So the top one here is like Detroit Red, right? Where he was like when he was a pimp, a hustler, a drug dealer, And then the one on the left is with the glasses is his ascension. So that's when he becomes a part of the Nation of Islam, right? So then he's going downwards, and then his ascension is when he's coming up, when you see his eyes are closed there, and that's the Malcolm X that we saw, the martyr, the one who was preaching all, love and brotherhood and sisterhood of mankind and humanity, and so what's happening in this card is that what's missing is, you see there's a lever, but there's no one pushing the lever, right? So that means when Malcolm X was killed, the movement stopped, right? The wheel stopped. So it's our responsibility to continue the movement, right? And it's our responsibility to put our hands on that lever and make it move, right? So the beauty of this card, there's a duality to it. There's like one duality that perhaps you are the one who is stuck and you need the help of the other to make your movement, to keep your movement going, right? Or the other way around is that you are the one who are liberating and making the movement for others.
Wow.
But in all senses, Malcolm X's struggle, we have to add it, recently I did some, they're online actually. I did these hour, or actually there were like 2 hour long episodes called Tarotism, like TAROT-ISM and or RISM. Anyways, I basically it's me just gabbing about the tarot cards, and for I think about 3 or 4 episodes I revisit speeches of Martin Luther King with John B. from the Invaders, who knew him personally. And man, I think everyone should do themselves the favor of like revisiting these speeches of Dr. King, because there's always this like I don't know what you would call it, but like Dr. King was made into this like angelic space being kind of from but when you look at and listen to these speeches, it's just remarkable what visions he had and how clear it was, how clear injustice was in his mind, and like pinpointing, attacking capitalism, attacking, industrialization, just like it's really, really worth it to revisit these speeches. And especially now, because I mean, you hear it all the time. Oh, everything they said back then still applies, but it does, and I don't know what, I mean, it just seems to me now that the crooked people in this world are now even more like villainous. You know what I mean? Like it's almost like a joke.
Well, it's like when you think about the karma of an action, it's the more aware you are, the more exposure you have to the results of your actions, the more powerful the karma. So if there's so much information around the world, I think the excuses for being naive or being in a bubble or having an isolated point of view, it's getting less and less believable.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I'm very proud of my daughters that they don't have this desire to appeal to everyone like this what do you call it? Like a narcissistic desire, like, oh, selfies and like, oh, look at me, I'm wearing this fashion label that I got for free. Like the whole influencer world, all this shit. It just nauseates me to no extent, like if you're young, you should be worrying or learning about other things rather than, being someone who's going to be whatever, influence a bunch of people to buy a bunch of useless garbage.
It's the distinction between what you're doing, which is artistic expression to move things, and like the staid sort of plastic expression of like image, that's preconceived and held on to. Wow, man, this has been incredible. So much to sift through. You've not only given me material, but you've given me doorways. So
that's beautiful. Thank you. Yeah, and I mean, if you want to go further into this conversation, I'm totally happy to. Like, if you have more time later, want to make it like a more pitch or something like that. But that
would be great.
Yeah,
maybe we can go further into
really cool.
the Native American deck.
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic.
That sounds cool.
And
all right, man.
Someday when you're in New York, man, this office is yours. I'd love to, give.
Yeah, I would love to come and check it out. Definitely. All right, man.
Thanks so much.
Take care. My pleasure. All right.
Best to you.
Talk to you soon. Okay. Bye.
Thank you so much for listening to this podcast. I'm so excited to do this with you all. Please give a review give a like, whatever it is. Give me some feedback so I know how to present the best show possible. Special thanks to Barrett Martin for his music, and we'll keep it rolling. Tune in next week. I'm Frank Vogt, Hunting for Heroes podcast.